It's time to unlap after the Canadian Grand Prix. We were all back in our rightful spots, meaning Nate Saunders went across the pond. You are home, dried out as well. Do you have your raincoat intact?
I do, yeah. I do. I didn't have it when it was raining at its heaviest in Montreal, but I do have it now. And I've come back to the UK, and amazingly, it's not raining in the UK. So I feel like I got that completely wrong. But yeah, back in the UK, had a great time in Canada. Awesome city if no one's been before. And yeah, I thought it was a pretty good. I thought it was a decent race. You know, not the best ever, but pretty fun. You know, there's a lot going on, so I enjoyed it.
We certainly missed you on the ESPN post-race show that Laurence and I joined. Laurence alleges that you are the most forgetful person he has ever worked with. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that is fair. So another thing happened in the weekend. I have a San Diego Padres cap that I've left it in different places, including at the weekend, left it on my desk. And Chris Medland hung the hat above me in the media center on a hook, and I didn't see it the whole day until we left the media center, and I didn't even realize I'd lost it. So yeah, it's something Laurence has had to live with for a long time. Just my general forgetfulness. Often when we're walking to the car, and I'll say, "Oh, I've left this random item in the media center," or "I think I've lost it," and it's actually just buried in my bag. So Laurence is a long-suffering witness to all of this.
If I remember rightly, that cap would still be on a boat in Monaco. Had it, well, God knows where the boat would be now, but
it would still be on a yacht in Monaco. Well. And then This was it. Yeah, we were leaving the boat, and Laurence said, "You've got anything, Nate?" And I was like, yeah, my hat." It also would have also still been on in a media shuttle in Budapest. I think it still would have been in the Silverstone media center. There's all kinds of places it would have been had Laurence or Medland or someone not pointed out that I wasn't in fact wearing it. So yeah, but I've still got it. Amazingly, it's one of the only bits of clothing that I still have managed to keep over a long period of time. So magic hat.
After all this is said and done, you guys could write a book, The Brotherhood of the Traveling Cap, instead of The Sisterhood of the Traveling
It's going that way, Katie. Honestly, it's quite worrying.
Seriously,
but it just keeps. It's like Jumanji. It keeps finding me again. It keeps coming back.
I love it. I love it. Remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, like our video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Let's dive into the different storylines that unfolded in Canada. It was clearly a record-breaking performance and weekend for Red Bull. They hit 100 wins as a team and organization. Max Verstappen tied Ayrton Senna with 41 race wins. We talk at length about the dominance of Max Verstappen and what he's been able to do in such a short time in his early career. Can you guys characterize what we're seeing from him now that he is fifth, I believe, tied for fifth or fourth at this point on all-time win list?
He's tied for fifth now with Ayrton Senna. Next up is Alain Prost, who's on 51 victories. Max is now on 41. So he's right up there with the greatest names in the sport, and rightly so. I mean, I don't think it was really in doubt. It's funny how these things only kind of come into people talking about it when they hit certain milestones of races, but Max is no better a driver after Sunday's race than he was before. It's just that he's all of a sudden got himself into this top five. But I think for some time we've known that he is one of the greatest drivers ever to race in F1. It was kind of obvious when he was younger that he was going to be something pretty special, but ever since he won the championship in 21, then doubled down last year, and then just is now accelerating forward, it's clear that he is that good. He had that battle with Lewis Hamilton in 2021 for the championship, proved just how good he is and how fierce a competitor he is. And so really, I don't think it's any surprise that we're talking about him as one of the top drivers. And also, realistically, at the age of 25, he could comfortably go over 103 victories, which is Lewis Hamilton's record at the moment. Of course, Hamilton is still competing, so may win more races if Mercedes get it together. So that number could still go up. I wouldn't like to bet which one would finish their career with the most victories, but he's going to be in that area. I think he's going to be in three figures by the time he retires. He's that good. He's on that trajectory. And yeah, it's no surprise at all for me to hear that he's been talked about as one of the greats.
What was the reaction on the ground afterwards from Red Bull?
Yeah, I think the thing with Red Bull is and Christian Horner, when you speak to him, is I think they're just continually blown away by him, you know, by just the level that he keeps setting. I think actually the race was super impressive, but I think they were actually just more blown away by, in all the chaos of Saturday, the rain, you know, the changing conditions. Max was still comfortably on pole. You know, he got through, and there was never really a moment when you thought Max isn't going to make it through. And Christian just said he's just got such a handling of those situations that at no point do they ever feel like he's on the cusp of really dropping out of them. Obviously, that's a big contrast to what we saw with Perez and we've seen with other drivers. So I think Red Bull, and one thing that keeps amazing them when, and we've spoken to friends of ours at Red Bull, I think they're amazed by what Max does on track, but I think they're just as amazed by the fact that he has some of these performances and he's so calm before and after. There was a story, I think, after that incredible pole position in Monaco, one of the people who works very closely with Max said he, about 10 minutes after doing the media sessions there, rather than the adrenaline flowing, he was just watching some gaming YouTube, on his iPad, just chilling out at the back. And I think they find it surprising that he seems in his head to be quite removed from the awe that everyone else has for him. I don't think, he seems to show it in the same way. So, and that probably explains why he is so calm out in front. All these things happen. I know sometimes on the radio, he can, like any great driver, he can get angry with his team, but he just seems so calm and relaxed. And especially right now, that seems to be getting better and better. So I think Red Bull, if you were to ask them, is this as good as Max can get? I think most people would say no. I think he can just keep getting better because, as Laurence said, the trajectory is just so good with him, and it's like a hockey stick. It's never eased off. It's just been getting better and better. So yeah, I think they're blown away by him, and I think it's always telling. We saw the same with Lewis Hamilton. I think when he was dominating, you would talk to people at Mercedes, and they were just like, we don't know how he's doing it. Obviously the car's great, but you need the driver in the car to deliver, and Max is just going above and beyond to do that every week.
I think that calmness can sometimes come across as nonchalantness, which is certainly a good thing. That means obviously he's at the highest of the highs right now. And as you guys have both mentioned, he's only going to continue to progress. Would you say, Laurence, that calmness and maybe nonchalantness is impressive, or does it lead you for cause for concern that his heart isn't going to be in this sport for a long period of time?
I'm not sure about that, because all that Max has known and been a part of throughout his entire life, from the age of being essentially 3 or 4 years old, is racing. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you remove that from his life, it would be quite a shock to him. I think he would be missing something quite big. And we've seen this a number of times with drivers when they're in the mid-20s, and certainly if they're being successful and they're asked about, well, how long will you continue to drive? And they're always a bit reluctant to say that I'll still be there when they're in their 30s, because the idea of what's going to happen in 10 years time when you're 25 seems a huge amount of a distance away. And it seems like it's hard to believe that you'll still be doing the same thing. But the reality is, once they get there, and if they're still enjoying it, and if it's still a big part of their life, then they will continue. And Max has kind of suggested that he doesn't like some of the ways the sport is going. He really doesn't like sprint races, for example. So he's often used that as, well, if they continue to add sprint races and if they continue to add rounds to the championship, I'm going to walk away. But how serious is he about that? I don't know. He's got a contract through to 2028 anyway. But the sport could look quite different even in that span. But realistically, I think he'd have to have something to fill it with. So yeah, he wants to go and race at Le Mans. That's quite clear. I actually think he probably could do that whilst racing in F1. A number of the drivers were asked about that in Canada after the Le Mans 24 hours recently, and a lot of them said that the calendar is too packed and they can't find a way to do it. But I think with Max, especially if he's dominant as he is right now, it is probably possible that he finds a way to kind of loop it in. But even then, that's something that you can do when you're in your 40s, and there's lots of much older drivers racing at Le Mans. It's quite a different discipline. So I can't see a situation where he gets truly bored of F1, because I think it's such a big part of his life that he will miss it greatly if he does. So even if he does, he may do a Schumacher or an Alonso where they take 2 years out, kind of mid-career, and then come back. I could see maybe him doing that, but even that, at the moment, I think is pretty unlikely. He loves racing, he really does. And if he sounds a little bit bored on the radio, that's probably just because he's having it a bit easy at the moment. As soon as it becomes competitive, you hear a very different Max on the radio, sometimes a very frustrated Max, and that shows you how much he wants it.
Well, going for the fastest lap a couple weekends ago in Spain, that shows you just how competitive he is, how much I think he does care about every single point in the Drivers' Championship and ultimately the Constructors' Championship. So the competitive nature is certainly there. I wonder at what point, when you're winning, and it's coming so easily, do you get bored, as you mentioned? But certainly we hope somebody will be able to push Red Bull in the near future, the coming future. Nate, let's turn gears a little bit and shift our eyes to the opposing person in the garage, being Sergio Perez.
Who's not pushing him for those wins.
Yeah, exactly. We need somebody to push him, and it was his teammate Sergio Perez early on in the season, but of course that has fallen off in the late last couple of weeks. So, why do you feel like Sergio Perez continues to struggle, especially when it comes to qualifying?
Yeah, it's a strange one, isn't it? Because it feels like he's in a downward spiral, and I think that it's very telling to me that Christian Horner has now, on multiple occasions, I think he said it after the last race, and he said it again at the weekend. He said Sergio's got to stop thinking about the championship and go race by race. So clearly, the feeling within Red Bull is that Sergio's getting himself worked up about the championship. He obviously had a very good start to the season. I think coming into Miami, I think people were starting to think, well, maybe Checo can kind of string this out for a little bit. Then obviously that was a really deflating defeat for him. Obviously, he was out ahead. Max was starting so far back, and then 3 straight qualifyings. And we see this with great drivers when they're against good drivers. It's very easy to suddenly, for the good driver who's still very, very talented in their own right, to kind of get into this spiral, because Checo made the mistake in Monaco, and that almost entirely writes off your chances of having a good weekend there. So immediately he had that after Miami. Spain, again, you're pushing a bit too hard. He's thinking, I've got to make up lost ground. You make a mistake again. So you're constantly having to kind of almost push harder to make up for the mistake that you just made. But the mistake you just made was to make up for a mistake you made before that. So I think that there is something to that with Christian. Perez probably needs to look at it and just completely reset. They're coming to Red Bull's home race now. But it's bizarre as well, because I think, Checo's, I don't think he's been as strong a qualifier as Verstappen since he's been at Red Bull. But I always kind of had him down as somebody who was fairly strong in qualifying. And the fact that there's been 3 in a row, I think they've all been very different, but it just shows you a driver who's maybe not quite there with confidence, who I think he was, you could argue that obviously Monaco was just a straight up mistake, but the way the rain fell in Canada at the weekend, it could have caught other drivers out, but the fact it didn't catch Max out, you've got to give Max credit there as well. So I don't know. It seems, I think we're in another Bottas 2.0 situation, really, where you've got a very good driver who, and I made this point as well to another journalist. If you're Sergio Perez, you've spent 10 years, you waited 9 years for your first F1 race win. That whole time, you never had a car that could take you to race wins. The race win you got was an incredible victory, incredible drive on your part. You suddenly step up to Red Bull. You suddenly have a car that's tantalizingly close to the championship. And in the first year, you're not really in the fight, but Max is, and you think, right, after year 2, I'll get him. Year 2, you don't get him. Year 3, the car's even better. It's possibly the best car Sergio Perez is ever going to drive, and he's falling short as well. So that, on top of the championship, it just must be a lot for him to take, because he knows that these opportunities don't just come to you every year. If you don't utilize them, they can fall through your fingertips. So I think there's a lot of things going on there. And I think just for the sake of the championship, but also for the sake of Checo, I feel like the next race win it would just be very good if it was him who won it.
With all that said, Laurence, do you feel like it's more of Sergio Perez isn't the driver up to task, or this is just how difficult it is being Max Verstappen's teammate, or a little bit of both?
It's a bit of both, I think. I mean, we've seen Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, to some extent Daniel Ricciardo, struggle as Max Verstappen's teammate. And we see it a lot when there is one of these generational talents in the car and other drivers have to go up against them. We saw it with Bottas, we saw it with Barrichello at Schumacher, although really it was more weighted towards Schumacher. It was within contracts that he was going to basically win the championship if there was an opportunity. So, it's a tricky position to be in, but I think, Checo is struggling to deal with it. Because remember, all these drivers gone through their whole life pretty much believing that they are the best driver in the world and that they can win a world championship when they have the car. And then when you get given that opportunity, as Nate was just saying, and you don't do it, it is quite a knock to the confidence, and trying to get your head around that and reset yourself. All the while, the person in the other car is setting lap times that you cannot compete with, and doing things which are very special with the car. And then you have this thing in all successful teams that naturally do tend to gravitate around the person that's going to do the best. So in terms of car updates, the team will always do what the data tells them. So they'll always do what the wind tunnel's saying in terms of, how do we put more downforce on the car? But then there's also the drivability element, and if the drivers cannot realize that downforce in an actual racing situation, then it's actually pretty pointless. But with Max, it seems like he can drive a car even when it's really, really loose at the rear, and just make things happen in a car that perhaps any other driver gets in and struggles with. And so if Red Bull have found more and more performance, but it's a car that is quite difficult to drive, then it's only going to go that way. Now, I think that was more the case last year than this year. This year, the car seems quite benign and well balanced, which is one of the reasons why they are so far ahead. But Checo's, he's going to be very disappointed, because if you look specifically at his issues, it's often been the same thing. It's under braking is where he's really lacking to Max, and he'll be able to see that in the data, and he'll be able to see where Max is braking, and he'll probably go out in a practice lap, try that, realize how difficult it is to do, and then just come back in and think, how on earth do I match that? And then that led to a mistake in Australia qualifying. It's led to a mistake in Monaco qualifying, and it led to a mistake in Spain. All kind of issues which started in the braking phase and then ended up either in the barrier or a gravel trap. So that's what he's up against, but there's no easy way to find a way out of it, especially if the raw natural talent is biased in one way, and I just don't really see a way that Checo turns that around immediately. If you look back at times when that has kind of been the case, and a driver who's perhaps not as talented has gone on to win. The most recent and obvious example is Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton, but that had to get quite nasty. And also Nico was on a good level in that championship, but it required a lot of bad luck for Lewis early in the year. Nico to take advantage, pile the pressure on, and then it got quite nasty between the two of them for him to go and win a championship. Checo already, that part of the season has gone, that opportunity has gone. Max has already got enough points in the bank that even if things go wrong for him for 2 or 3 races, you'd still put your money on him to win the championship. So I can't see a way back into it for Checo other than trying to reset, just trying to learn, trying to develop, and then having another go next year in his final contract year.
I was going to say, I don't think there's that much bad luck Max Verstappen could be stuck with moving forward to not win the championship this season.
It would need to be quite historic levels of bad luck, you would think.
Yeah. And I just can't wrap my head around or foresee that happening. Nate, you were on the ground in Montreal and you got to spend some time with Daniel Ricciardo, who's could be a possibility in terms of, moving forward with Red Bull. He's a part of this equation to a degree. What did he express to you about his hopes moving forward in the future?
Yeah, he was very candid with me. He said, he's always kind of, since he's taken the sabbatical, he's always said, I want to come back to racing with a front running team, but he's never really explicitly said, I want to race at Red Bull. I think he was, it's a bold statement. And that's what he said to me. He said it would be a fairy tale to come back here. We were talking in the Red Bull hospitality. And he said, if I could have it my way, that's how the story of my career would end, which is interesting because, going back there, I think it was pretty obvious that was something he wanted to do. But until you hear him say it, you don't know whether he has that desire, whether he has that belief. And then you start to think, well, okay, how does he do that? How does he come back? And what was actually the most interesting thing to me was that after he said that, he said, even if I have to work my way back up to get there, I'll do whatever I can. Now, I took that to mean, he's open to the idea of AlphaTauri, which I then had sources confirm to me is something he's thinking about. And that's interesting because it's a big change in mindset for him. But I think it's clear, and we can get into this now, but I think it's clear that Ricciardo, if he comes back to race, he wants to do it either at AlphaTauri or Red Bull, with the end goal, if it is AlphaTauri, being that it's kind of a 1-year thing, and then he ends up at Red Bull. Because the context here, obviously being that Sergio Perez is under contract until next year. And I think it's interesting because I've had no indication yet that Perez's contract situation is under threat as it stands. If this form continued, that might change, but I think Red Bull are wary of just how much they could upset things by, changing things up. If the rivals are closer next year, you put Ricciardo in the car, let's say, you don't know the Ricciardo you're getting. You don't know whether you're getting the 2018 Ricciardo who left you and was a mega talent, or more likely and more realistically, are you getting the Ricciardo who struggled and is down on his confidence? And then, as we just talked about, a driver down on his confidence, you're putting him up against Max Verstappen. How's that going to work out? So I think Ricciardo is kind of in the position of playing the long game, but yeah, I think his mind now is slowly turning back to when he can come back and what the quickest route is back to that seat.
Also important to point out that AlphaTauri actually just was passed by Williams in the constructors based on Alex Albon's performance. Laurence, you mentioned he was a former teammate of Max Verstappen. Can we please talk about what a great weekend he had for Team Williams? Obviously, qualifying, they took a huge risk going into Q2, coming out on slicks when he thought that the track was drying up, and then that turned out to be the rule of thumb for everybody. Everybody was trying to go back in and change the tires, a little too late for some, Sergio Perez being one. Gets the risk done, gets into Q3, and then he's able to finish on the points on one set of tires that at the end of the race, you thought, is he even going to make it? And he was able to do so. Just, can you characterize the drive, the weekend from Alex Albon, and if he's one of the more underrated drivers on the grid at this point?
I think the most impressive thing about that weekend is that it was one of the rare tracks that actually kind of suits the Williams relative to the other teams. And that's because that car doesn't have a huge amount of downforce. I don't know if they were embarrassed, but there was photos of the floor of that car when it got lifted up in Spain, and it looked very basic.
Yeah. We remember.
We
talked about it, didn't we?
Of the Red Bull and the Mercedes, and now we've seen bits of the Ferrari as well. And so that car doesn't have a huge amount of downforce, but it is quite good in a straight line. It is quite fast in a straight line. So you look at the layout of the Montreal circuit, and it's one which will suit it. Now, what makes that more impressive, though, is that there was a lot of pressure then to perform. Just as we talk about, Checo under pressure and other drivers under pressure, this was Williams' it's a really good chance, really good opportunity to get points. And they took a risk in qualifying, but a risk that was absolutely worth taking, because in a normal course of events, dry qualifying, they might hope to, again, track that suits them. Maybe they'll get like 14th, 13th tops. But all of a sudden, there was a route into Q3. They took it, absolutely executed it perfectly. Let's not take anything away from that lap either. He was on the right tires at the right time, but it was a very good, clean lap in still tricky conditions, despite being on the correct tires at that very moment. And then from there, it was really a case of what could they do in the race. And there was that early safety car, and then the opportunity to pit. They took it. But for most teams that then put them onto a two-stop strategy, Williams decided they were going to one-stop it, and that required an awfully long stint on a single set of tires. And we've seen Alex do that before. He did it in Australia last year, I think. And it is a real skill, because one, you've got to manage your performance. You can't just drive flat out. A lot of these drivers are very good at going fast, but to kind of get enough performance out of the car to remain ahead whilst still looking after those tires is a real balancing act, a real serious balancing act. And then do it with pressure from behind, DRS zones, and the rest of it. And again, he complimented the car. He said, well, the car's very good in the straight line, which helps. But it was a massively skillful performance, and further proof that Alex is an incredibly good driver. But we have known that for some time. And the question mark has always been after is, at Red Bull, where the pressure, or a year and a half it was at Red Bull, where the pressure clearly started to get to him towards the end. But he was a very young driver back then. He got given an opportunity that I don't think he'd expected to have at that stage of his career. In fact, it wasn't. If you go back just a couple of years before that, he didn't even look like he was going to make F1. He'd signed a deal to race in Formula E before he got the call up from Toro Rosso when they basically ran out of drivers. So that all came around a bit quick, and now we're seeing a very mature, talented driver in Alex, and kind of doing similar things to what we saw George Russell do when he was at Williams. So there's a possibility there, I think, that if a team is looking, if they need a driver, a capable driver, fast driver, then they'll start to look to Alex. Nate and I were talking about this earlier. He has a very rock solid contract, it seems, at Williams. But the contracts come to an end, and eventually either he'll look to see what Williams are offering him, whether they can actually move further up the grid. Obviously, James Vowles has some big plans for there, but every time you talk to James, it's always give us 2 years, give us 3 years, because there's a lot we need to change. Or whether he'll be able to fast route himself up with an offer from a big team. But he's certainly doing all the right things for either of those circumstances to come true.
Yeah, he was definitely a bright spot on the weekend. Unfortunately for his teammate, Logan Sargent, his race ended as quickly as it seemed to begin. There was mechanical issues, car issue on lap 8. And so he was forced to retire. We've been somewhat critical of him in the past. Obviously, this race, don't feel like you can put the onus on him for, the car failing him in that moment. But Nate, how would you describe, Logan Sargent's future moving forward? I know that Mick Schumacher is currently with Mercedes, but it seems like he's waiting in the wings for an opportunity to open up anywhere.
Yeah, and it's worth saying Logan also didn't have the upgrade. So, Albon had an upgraded car. Sargent didn't have that. It was tough actually to watch the weekend from Sargent's perspective, because on Thursday he was pretty honest actually. He said, I need to do better. I know I've been underperforming, and it's actually not that often you see drivers, especially at that age, be that candid. They can be very, very guarded. So I was actually quite impressed that he would say that to the media, because he knew that was going to be a headline. Williams would have said to him, if you say this will be a headline. And then for him to maybe not have the clean weekend to maybe show that, I think he's hoping to get the upgrades in Austria. I don't know with Sargent. I mean, I think Laurence said this well on a few shows ago. When you're a rookie, you come in. I mean, what have we had? 8 races, I think, so far. 8. Is it 8 or 9? 8. I can't do my maths off the top of my head, but I think it's 8. I keep losing. Yeah, I keep losing track with there's been some cancelled. There's been all that stuff. But he's still fairly new into his Formula One career, and the Mick Schumacher thing I think is interesting, because I just never got the feeling that Mick Schumacher was that impressive when he was at Haas. If you take away those 2 races where he scored points, he caused a lot of damage to the Haas team. In terms of the car, he was crashing quite a lot. I don't know whether that would be an upgrade. I think that Schumacher brought with him quite a bit of baggage behind the scenes. I think he was fine, but some of the people with him certainly gave Haas a headache. You don't get that impression with Sargent. Sargent's fit very well into that team, and I think that Williams, especially with Val's there, but historically have been very good with young drivers. But I think it's been a two-way street. They've had drivers who fit in there well, and don't really cause a huge issue. I mean, I know that kind of Latifi became a bit of a meme by the end of his career, but you never got the impression that people didn't like working with him there. He might not have been the quickest driver, but he fit in, and obviously he was bringing money with him as well. So I don't know whether Sargent is imminently in danger from Schumacher. I'm sure that Toto Wolff would want him to get that seat. But to me, when I saw the news, I don't think it would be an upgrade. I don't think we've seen enough from Sargent just yet to say Schumacher's better than him. He certainly hasn't had the accidents that Schumacher had at this point. He's had a few offs, but he's not had anything. Schumacher, I think it was last year for the first 6 months, he was putting the car in the wall, like, it seemed like every few weekends. Sargent hasn't done that yet. I think his biggest issue, obviously he went off in Spain, his biggest issue has more just been maybe the pace hasn't been there. There's been a few little mistakes and stuff like that. But I think if you're Williams, you want to give him a few more months, and you want to see the drive you've got by the end of the year. Because I don't think really dropping someone in the middle of the season is going to do Schumacher any good. Let's say that Schumacher, is in the frame. And it's also, obviously, it's not going to do Sargent any good. You just get rid of him halfway through the year. He'll say, well, I never had a chance to prove myself. Never gave me a full year.
Fair.
And Schumacher, let's not forget, Schumacher had 2 seasons. He didn't just have one. He had one in a very bad Haas car. Then he had one when the car was better last year. I don't know, really. I always say it, but I think if Mick Schumacher's name was Mick Fischer or Mick, pick any other German surname you can think of, I don't know whether people would really be that convinced that he deserves to drive anywhere on the grid. I just don't think his time in Formula One really proved that. And that's coming from someone who grew up as a Schumacher fan. I wanted him in the on the grid as much as anyone. But yeah, if it's a direct comparison between those two, I would definitely stick rather than twist. But Williams might look at it differently. But I don't think he's bringing more to the team than Sargent does currently.
Also, Sargent, Williams invested quite a lot in Sargent's career already. They basically funded his F2 career, and to just write that off after 8 races seems like a very strange,
harsh
business decision. Yeah, and as you say, I mean, look, if the other option was like Max Verstappen, sure, okay, obviously you're going to stick him in, but the other option is Mick Schumacher, and for all the reasons that Nate said, he didn't do enough to impress last year, and suggest that he's the right option. And at the moment, Williams, they need results like they had in Canada from Alex. They need results where they're going to, just scrape a few points here and there, get themselves off the foot of the Constructors' Championship, get a few more million in the bank. It's very much a long-term process, and just chopping between drivers at this stage isn't going to help with the development of the car. It isn't going to help with anything, really. It's not going to help with morale within the team. So I just don't see a situation where it would make any sense to do that. And it's very easy to say, isn't it? Look, swap drivers around mid-season, but it's so much harder for the driver coming in than you might imagine, because with no testing and getting to know, even just understanding what every button does on the steering wheel is not an easy thing to do within the space of a couple of races. So you're potentially throwing away a couple of opportunities there, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. Longer term, maybe, maybe it could be an option if Mick Schumacher comes with some funding for 2024, 2025, and Logan can't compete. Maybe, sure, then you're adding something worthwhile, but mid-season just doesn't make sense to me.
There's something go ahead.
Sorry, Katie. I think the Albon equation here is important as well. I think it's a bit, and Laurence, mentioned with when Russell was there, I don't think any driver really who's available would look good currently against Albon. Albon's performing so well. So it's easy to think, oh, this driver's just rubbish, but it might just be the benchmark they're up against is a bit higher. And then it comes back to exactly what Laurence was saying. So many reasons to just not get rid of someone. But I think whoever you put in there right now, if it's Schumacher, whoever it is, Albon's going to be the better guy.
I was just going to say that you put a premium on continuity in this sport, certainly. And I think, as Laurence had mentioned, if you append that at this moment, you wouldn't have the continuity to be able to progress.
And just on Albon, I think it's worth us saying, because I'm so impressed with him currently. And I know there was certainly a desire last year within his camp to see if he could get out of that contract. Not saying he wanted to get out of it desperately, but I think he recognized that there was an opportunity to move around the grid, and there was definitely interest in him. And I think that going forward, we talked about Ricciardo earlier. If I was predicting anything now, I would say, let's say we do get a year where Danny Ric ends up in AlphaTauri and Albon is still doing this at Williams next season. He's not affiliated with Red Bull anymore, but I think Albon going back to Red Bull, I think, is just as likely as Ricciardo. It was very telling. Christian Horner, every interview he did on Sunday, with all the different broadcasters, he just out of nowhere would say, I have to say as well, great drive from Alex. Obviously, there's a former link there, but it's not a link that exists currently. So I think Red Bull, and on Albon as well, when everyone says Albon and Gasly together both didn't compete against Verstappen, which is true. When Gasly left, you got the impression it was his fault from the team. They said Gasly didn't really fit in well here. He didn't really listen to feedback, etc. That was kind of the rap on him. With Albon, you could tell that Red Bull kind of wanted it to work. And the only reason really in the end it didn't was because they realized going into 21, we need a competitive second driver. And they had Sergio Perez available. And they said, we're not going to get a driver this competitive, this well-rounded, this experience. And Albon hadn't quite done enough to kind of keep that seat. But I think when he left, there was an understanding that we probably didn't do fully right by him either. That's why Red Bull kind of did keep him around. So Albon's actually a really interesting character going forward, I think, in the driver market, because a lot of teams are probably looking at him right now and saying that guy is super, super fast. And, like Laurence mentioned, that's not an easy drive to do what he did at the weekend. So, I think he's going to be a name we're talking about a lot more like in the next year or so, just because, and that contract does, I said to Laurence earlier, it seems like it's made from cement from everything I've heard from it. It's very difficult to get out of. But if he can get out of it, and or if he's just able to, obviously to leave at the end of next year, I think he'll go somewhere pretty good.
The way you just described him near the end of your answer kind of reminds me of the way that people talk about Lando Norris, and a smaller storyline coming out of obviously the race weekend was the 5-second penalty he received for unsportsmanlike conduct for driving too slow under a safety car. So he finished 9th on track, but ultimately fell back to 13th out of the points because of that 5-second penalty being added on after the fact. He seemed a little surprised or wasn't understanding where it came from and why. And I think, Nate, you had an opportunity to explain to him exactly why he received the penalty, and he understood it from that point.
Yeah, so I think I couldn't have been the first journalist to explain it to him, because he'd been through about 7 interviews by that point with the media. But he came in and we asked him, do you know what the penalty was for? And he said no. And one of the journalists said, so you're unsportsmanlike now, or something. Very weird way of asking the question. And Lando was kind of like, what do you mean? And then we said, well, the penalty was called unsportsmanlike conduct, and we explained it to him. But it was just a funny moment, because they come pretty much straight from the car to the media pen as well. So he obviously he obviously knew he had a penalty, but I don't know whether he'd been told that it was called unsportsmanlike conduct. I don't know. But yeah, it was just kind of a funny situation. And actually, to be honest with you, I think this has taken on a bit of a life of its own on social media, because a driver as experienced as Lando should know what he did was wrong. I don't know whether the wording has a different translation, and it does mean different things in different sports, but I think ultimately it was a fair penalty. And the fact that McLaren didn't really protest about it themselves, I think speaks volumes.
Laurence, do we see these unsportsmanlike conduct penalties often in the sport? And what's the kind of variety or range that we could see possibly from driving too slow under a safety car, XYZ?
Yeah, we don't see them that often, but this is something that is very tempting to do under a safety car. So what happened is you had Piastri and Norris running line astern, and if you create a big enough gap to your teammate, if you're the following car, and you create a big enough gap to your teammate, you can both pit under the safety car, and neither of you will lose any positions because you create a gap. Your teammate pits, the team does its kind of 2.5 second thing, and off he goes. And then if you time it perfectly, you're just coming into the pits afterwards, and you haven't had to sit there and wait while other cars are getting serviced and going past you on the way out. So that's why he got penalised, and it's fair. And the reason it was called unsportsmanlike behavior, which is not, or whatever it was, conduct, which is not something we regularly see in stewards' decisions, was because it was considered to be a breach of the International Sporting Code that refers to any infringement of the principles of fairness and competition behavior in an unsportsmanlike manner or attempt to influence the results of a competition in a way that is contrary to sporting ethics will be penalized. And that's kind of.
Are you reading that, or did you have that memorized, or is it tattooed on your arm?
I have that memorized. Yeah.
Honestly, you should, like, the stuff Laurence has memorized, Katie, is remarkable. Kate, it's the car journeys into circuits is me saying I've forgotten my hat and him reeling off things like that. It's quite remarkable. I'm really impressed.
And just in case you're wondering, that's Article 12.2.1.L.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Laurence carries the book with him. People sometimes carry a wallet. He carries a little sporting code with him.
Please
anyway,
carry on.
That's what it was. But it was absolutely right. If you watch the video, and the stewards pointed out that there was about 50 kilometers an hour difference between Piastri and Norris as they went down the straight towards the pits. They're both being told they were going to box. Norris seems to suggest that he didn't know he was going to box, but the radio comms suggest that he should have been aware of it at least. And so 50 kilometers an hour, 30 miles per hour under a safety car, that's quite a lot. If you watch the onboard, Piastri just turns into a little dot in the distance, disappears. You can't really see him as he's going into the pit lane. So it kind of seemed obvious what Norris was doing. If he didn't know he was doing that, then you'd have to question it as well, because that seems like a strange course of action. So, I think he was perhaps a bit annoyed because he hadn't been told it during the race. And I think the team didn't tell him, because if you tell a driver you got a 5-second penalty, it alters the way they race and all that kind of stuff. And, they can get angry with it. So, a little bit to sort out afterwards and a bit of a confusing situation. But I don't think you can argue with how the stewards implemented the rules on this occasion. I think it's right, and I think if anyone does it at a future race, they'll get exactly the same penalty.
Lando's in a weird place at the moment, isn't he? Because when I did speak to, when we were speaking to him in the mix zone, I said, was that? So I think I started off by saying, was that a frustrating race? You worked so hard at the end, and obviously had the moment with Ocon, but potentially lost points at the end. And he said, no, that was probably my best race of the year, most fun race of the year. And this is a Lando Norris we're talking about, a mega talent on the grid, and I think he had a great move on Piastri, which he did point out. There were some nice overtakes, but just so strange. He seems I don't know what the word is, but it's like he's struggling to enjoy the situation he's in. He's struggling to find any joy from that. He's obviously racing in Formula One. He enjoys that part of it, but you wonder where his head's at the moment. And I think I don't know. Some of his answers I find quite interesting at the moment, because he can be quite short, quite blunt, and it's different to the Lando of maybe last year when he thought, okay, maybe the car's only going to be bad this year. Maybe it's just got to be a bit patient. You wonder if that patience is wearing thin as well. So just and a shame as well, because I think Lando's just such a talented driver. I think he's one of those guys that when he's at the front, I think he'll be pretty awesome to watch. So I think that, on top of the fact he was being asked this question about this unsportsmanlike penalty, I think he just gave some moderately spicy answers just off the back of that as well.
A team that's starting to find a little bit of joy here lately, regardless of George Russell's retirement due to a brake issue after going into the barrier early on in the race in Canada, is Mercedes. Laurence and we had talked about this last week on Unlapped. If you were a Mercedes fan, would you go into Canada more giddy, or would you go in a little cautious, a little apprehensive that, these upgrades weren't going to show consistency and progress? And I think it's fair to say, Laurence, you had mentioned that Montreal wasn't necessarily the track to lend itself to the Mercedes car at the moment. But for Lewis Hamilton to end up on the podium, and likely George Russell would have been in the mix, certainly up there near the front, had his day gone a little bit differently. These upgrades are working. They've got another upgrade package coming at Silverstone in a couple weekends, July 9th. Toto says if any of the races they're going to win on the calendar, it's going to be that one. Do you agree, or is he just trying to keep everybody watching these races moving forward because it's Max Verstappen's to win?
I think it is Max Verstappen's to win, but if you're going to ask if there's any race you could win or you're most likely to win, what's it going to be? Silverstone's going to be right at the top of their list because one, they do have this upgrade package coming. They've talked about how this new direction, which they started off in Monaco with a big upgrade package, and it's been on the car in Spain and Canada, obviously, and they've kind of refined it slightly, found a bit more performance. Well, that's also opened up some new development opportunities in the wind tunnel, and that's what's going to come onto the car in Silverstone. So they made a step, and they believe there's another step to find as soon as Silverstone. So that's all very positive. Now, I don't think anyone at Mercedes is expecting it to get them close to Red Bull, especially around a circuit like Silverstone, which will suit the Mercedes, but will also suit the Red Bull. But, you know, I think there is this question is, can Red Bull win every race? And the obvious answer every time is probably not, because at some point something's going to go wrong, be it reliability, you know, unfortunately time safety car, weather on the wrong lap, that kind of thing. And all of those things can happen at Silverstone. So I think what Toto is probably saying is that they're most likely to be in a position to capitalize on anything that happens to Red Bull at a track like Silverstone. And I think it's a track where, for example, they should hope to be ahead of Aston Martin, who also made a significant step in Canada. But I think it wasn't quite as obvious because Fernando was dealing with some brake issues towards the end of the race. And but even so, he still fell behind Lewis and got back ahead of him, which kind of shows you that while Mercedes have made steps, Aston Martin aren't hanging around either. So I think they're looking Silverstone because they know it's a track a bit like Spain, some similar characteristics. In Spain, they were the obvious best of the rest. They were still a long way off Max, but they got 2 cars on the podium. And so they're looking at Silverstone, and I think they're thinking, you know, why not something similar there? It's also kind of relatively a home race for them and a number of teams, actually, including Aston Martin, who are just across the road, but it's a home race as well for Mercedes. So there's always a venue where they look to do pretty well, and they actually have done pretty well in the past. So yeah, I think there's an opportunity there, but I don't think he's saying, look, we're going to go to Silverstone and win, just beat Red Bull straight up. He's saying we're going to go there and we'll have a chance to take advantage.
It's said that Red Bull is already focusing on next year's car. Laurence, how much time do you think that Mercedes should focus on 2023 versus the 2024 car? And can you just describe how teams kind of split their focus on the season that we're in and then obviously the future?
Yeah, I'd be surprised if there isn't a single team that hasn't devoted some focus at least towards next year. The good news is we've got relatively stable regulations, even more stable than they were from last year to this year, because there was a change in the floor height and stuff like that. So you can, if you develop something and it works for this year's car, well, it will actually work for next year's car as well. So while Red Bull may be looking at stuff for 2024, they aren't really planning a concept change. They have this very good, rich vein of development that they're tapping into at the moment. So they'll just be going deeper and deeper into that. And some of that will help this year's car. Some of it may require some more fundamental changes, and they'll be looking at how they can do that in 24. Meanwhile, Mercedes have made some big changes already to this car, but there's some certain stuff that they just cannot change because it would require a new chassis, and they can't build and develop a new chassis under the cost cap because they will blow it all within the space of a couple of months. So, but they can develop one for next year because they're going to need a new chassis anyway next year. So, that's what they're working on is kind of trying to understand the big changes they can make. But that's the thing, you know, because the regulations are stable, any benefits you find now, and now that Mercedes have gone off on this different development path by changing the front suspension, any advantages they can find there will feed into next year as well. So I think compared to other seasons where we've talked about the importance of focusing on the following year as opposed to this year, it's probably a little bit more subtle this year just because the regulations are going to be stable going through. But anyone looking to really mix up the concepts of the car, one, they will have to make those decisions very soon, because when we're talking about big things like rear suspension mounting points and cockpit positions and stuff like that, that all has to be agreed on relatively early on. And then, you know, the stuff which they're working on up towards the launch of the car, it's all very small little aero flicks and, fancy bits, but the fundamental decisions really have to be put in place now. So Mercedes will be doing that. Red Bull will be doing that as well. But they will all be doing it with knowledge and lessons and, understanding from the current car that they can then put into next year's.
I'm just reminiscing about the three of us standing in New York City at the Red Bull launch this year and squinting at the RB19 to see if there was any difference in that livery whatsoever, and not finding a single difference.
Well, that was because we were actually squinting at an RB18, like just just exactly. Repainted.
But it might as well have been the RB19. Yeah, we might as well have been looking at the same thing.
But yeah, it's it's an interesting development ground, and seeing how much teams vary from what they have now. Because Ferrari's another team where you kind of feel that they had a good concept when they hit the ground running in 2022. Mm-hmm. Now it seems like they've hit a bit of a ceiling with that. So how big a change do they make? How brave do they get back at Maranello to make some big changes? Because you kind of feel if they carry on the same direction they are at the moment, can't really see it, overhauling Red Bull. But then to make that big concept change is such a big step, because you're basically, not writing off, but you are disregarding a lot of what you've worked on so far for something which is kind of a journey into the unknown. So yeah, it'd be fascinating to see what decisions teams are making, and they'll be making them now, but we won't find out until start of next year.
Must be two words drivers hate hearing more than any is concept change, for that reason. Imagine that you're just, because it, that the rest of the year's a write-off, and probably spilling into next year as well is questionable, especially if you do it this late if you're Ferrari as well.
Yeah, people don't seem to love change. They seem to resist it from time to time. Speaking of change and a possibility of change in the sport, Bridgestone has actually lodged a bid to replace Pirelli as the Formula One tire supplier beginning in 2025, I believe.
Yeah,
could we see this happening? And would teams, drivers welcome this change, or are they set and happy with Pirelli at this point?
I think the drivers certainly would. I think drivers for a long time have had, it's fair to say, reservations with the Pirelli tyre. And I feel for Pirelli to a degree, because they've had a very specific... So they've been the tyre supplier solely for F1 since 2011. And especially over the last few years, they've had very specific remits from Formula One of kind of the types of tyre they need to be developing. And the issue has always been that drivers don't feel that the tyres really give them what they want. They don't have tyres that they can push on perfectly. Pirelli's been kind of, I guess has been at different points, has been trying to work out how to make, because ultimately if the tyres aren't great, the racing's not going to be great. You need that variation in the tyres, but you also need tyres that drop off at certain points and stuff like that. And drivers, there's other things as well. I mean, there's all sorts of issues going on at the moment with, tyre blankets, etc. That's been a long running issue. So I think if it was down to the drivers solely, I think that they'd happily just kind of put the Pirellis in the bin and say, let's move on to someone else. And Bridgestone has history. They were the guys that were in before Pirelli. And they were, to me, I mean, growing up, Bridgestone felt like they were always involved in some way. That used to be Bridgestone and Michelin, through the Schumacher era. So they really would come in, and they've launched what sounds like a very serious bid. They would come in with some quite serious pedigree there as well. So I think it's very much open. I think that Pirelli, speaking to people at Pirelli this weekend, it's the first time they've actually seemed, kind of convinced that this could be the beginning of the end of their time as a sole supplier.
Laurence, do you agree? Do you feel like it would be a good change?
So Bridgestone, yes, when they were in the sport, they created very durable, arguably tyres with better characteristics than the ones we have now. But there's been some big changes. We're talking over a decade since Bridgestone were last in the sport. The cars are now 200 kilos heavier. They create more downforce than they've ever created before. They're lapping faster than ever. So the strain on the tyre is far greater than it ever was when Bridgestone were in the sport. And I don't know, because I've not asked and I've not really seen what Bridgestone have been up to in that decade. But that's a huge amount of development. And so not only would there's no guarantee that they're able to build a tyre that's better, they also have to then go through a testing process. And the problem with testing tyres for Formula One car is that you need a Formula One car. And it's no good having a Formula One car from 5 years ago, because it will not be the same as a Formula One car now. And ideally, you want the best drivers in the car as well to give you feedback. Now, Pirelli have had this testing process over some time, and sure, if Bridgestone get the nod, you'd hope that there would be enough availability of cars and teams and drivers to make sure they have a full testing process in place. But it seems to me like it would be a big, a big commitment, a big step. And while yes, their history suggests they are up to it, it's asking an awful lot of a company, and then to believe that they would all of a sudden solve all of F1's issues with Bridgestone tires, I'm not 100% convinced. But look, I mean, if they do win it, there'll be good reasons for it. It goes to what we call a tender. So the FIA have to decide from a sporting perspective, and then Formula One, so Stefano Domenicali, decides from a commercial perspective, because of course being F1's tyre supply is not just about supplying the tyres. There's also the important thing of the exposure you get from it, and the amount of money you pump into it to get that exposure back as well. So all of that will have to be decided behind closed doors, and I fully trust that F1 would make the right decision, and I fully trust that Bridgestone would be able to create tyres that are capable of existing in Formula One and working on Formula One cars. I just question whether they're going to be this kind of fix-all instant, solution to all the problems that drivers have with the tires at the moment, which is mainly overheating when they're behind others, and also just dealing with the immense strain of these very heavy Formula One cars now, with a lot of downforce going through extremely high speed corners. Getting that right is not easy, and obviously safety is the thing that has to come first. So I hope that if Bridgestone do it, they just get every opportunity to test, and everyone is on board, and we all fully commit to it, and it works for them. But yeah, just a bit dubious that it's going to solve F1's tire issues completely.
We have a Pirelli media dinner on Friday as well, so I'm hoping that with the extra fear of losing the seat, the meal's always amazing pre-British GP, but it's but no, I agree with Laurence. Just joking aside, I think it could be a case of be careful what you wish for, better the devil type thing, because I think the
grass isn't always greener.
Yeah, and I think Laurence hit the nail on the head. The dirty secret is that Formula One cars, they're changing so much, and I don't really think that there's an easy solution to it, because there's so many things. And I think drivers. The other issue is that drivers and engineers always want very different things, don't they? From what hits the track. So I don't know. I think it'll be an interesting one to follow, but I just hope it's not something where it's one step forward, two steps back for Formula One, because if a new tire supplier comes in and they don't get it right, everyone's got those tires, and then the narrative isn't we don't like Pirelli, it's suddenly we don't like Bridgestone now. So I don't think that would help anyone.
Well, regardless of the tires on these cars, there's certain teams that have had underwhelming starts to this season. Williams obviously had a bright spot in Alex Albon's weekend. We mentioned that earlier, but I'm just curious of the teams kind of at the bottom of the barrel so far this season. Laurence, who would you say has been somewhat of a disappointment?
I think the most disappointing team is the one at the bottom of the championship. I'm not just saying that because that's the way the points have fallen, but AlphaTauri, a team which, we always used to joke that they would target fifth in the Constructors' Championship every year and almost inevitably never get there. But I think kind of seventh or so is where they should be, because you've got to remember, rear end of that car is all Red Bull. So Red Bull gearbox, Red Bull rear suspension, Honda engine, just like Red Bull. And yet they're doing something wrong with the rest of it to be so far off the pace. I guess you've got to look a little bit at the drivers as well. Nick De Vries coming in, essentially a rookie. Yuki Tsunoda, it feels like he has stepped up significantly this year, but I do wonder as well, without Pierre Gasly's kind of gauge him against, it's harder to know how much of that is a step up and how much of that is Yuki making just like an incremental gain. So yeah, I just feel like they've not quite got it right, and they've failed to execute a few times in races, which has always been a trait of AlphaTauri in recent years. So if I look at all of the teams at the back of the grid right now, they're the most disappointing with the resources they've got. But there's there's other candidates as well. Haas seem to have great qualifying pace at the moment. Every time they get in a race, just disappears. So that's no good. It's all well and good. Nico Hülkenberg qualifying second in Canada. Of course, he then got the grid penalty, but the pace was there for second in the wet, right? But there was every sign that in the race, even if it started second, it wouldn't have made much difference. He probably would have finished out the points. So there's something very wrong going on there. But it is tough in F1. It's tough at the back of the grid, isn't it? Like you don't have quite as many eyeballs on you. It's not the Sergio Perez situation where everyone's saying like you should be winning every race, but it is tricky to get the results together. And then eventually when we look at the Constructors' Championship, you realize the big difference between the very top teams and the ones at the back.
Nate, who would you say?
Yeah, mine would have been Haas as well. I mean, we talked about Perez, but three straight disappointing races, but Haas haven't been in the points for 3 races either. And I think where they were last year, I think the team pointed and said, we have one competitive driver in K-Mag, we've got a good car, and Schumacher didn't get the most out of the car. So they've gone to 2 experienced drivers. And I think now the car's letting them down more than the drivers are. And I think that's always so frustrating for a team, because one of the whole points of getting this lineup they've got with Magnussen and Hülkenberg was, if the car's there, we'll be able to snatch points. And at the moment, it's just not up to that. So yeah, that's pretty disappointing. And just to quickly circle back, because Laurence mentioned Yuki, and I know that our friend Josh listens to this podcast sometimes. You would have seen it, but our friend Josh, who was head of social and digital content at AlphaTauri, got thrown into the river in Canada because he's leaving the team, and then Yuki jumped in after him. But Yuki gave him a nice send-off on the radio at the end of the race, which I thought was a great touch, and just added to the Yuki Tsunoda being a good guy that we've known for a while now. But yeah, I wanted to say that before we signed off, because it was a pretty cool moment. And apparently everybody on Twitter is now sending memes about Josh to Josh, which is funny because awesome. He's used to seeing them about Yuki obviously being one of his drivers. So yeah, that was a nice touch.
Yuki stays in the water. Wasn't Daniel Ricciardo with him on a boat? Was that in Australia, or where was that? And
Yuki just seems to love just jumping into the water. Things. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with him, but he just seems to. But what's great about the framing of that video in Canada is they throw Josh in, and then just out of nowhere, Yuki Tsunoda just comes kind of flipping in out of nowhere, like just it's obviously like, well, I want a piece of this as well, and in a really nice like AlphaTauri kind of like bit of clothing as well. He's not changed into something else. He's obviously jumped into some pretty nice clothing. So yeah. Love Yuki.
They basically saw you walking into the paddock after leaving your raincoat, and they decided that they needed to be wet like you.
Yeah, they said that can't be that bad. Look, he's just walking in with nothing. We'll just jump straight in.
Too good. As always, I appreciate you guys' time. Enjoy the weekend off. We'll be back with more previewing the Austrian Grand Prix. And remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review. Thanks. Cheers.